Hey, don't you worry, Jakey boy. I've got this in the bag. You sit there, look likable, and let me do all the talking. Silence in the courtroom, please. We're about to begin the case of the gamer community versus Jake Muller from Resident Evil 6. Mr. Muller's being defended by some nobody, which sounds about right. Pleased as punch to be here, Your Honor. Well, Mr. Nobody, your client stands accused of first-degree attempted murder of the Resident Evil franchise. How do you plead, you measly-mouthed bastard? Well, Your Honor, we're pleading not guilty by reason of comedy. What? Your Honor, I'm arguing that the charges against my client should be dropped because with the gift of hindsight, all of his crimes are really funny. Resident Evil 6 came out in 2012 and wasn't exactly received with open arms. To this day, it's a pretty controversial entry in the series. Ask an RE fan how they feel about it, and you'll get one of 4 answers. Answer A: oh man, that game absolutely sucked. Answer B: it wasn't terrible, but I really didn't care for it. Answer C: you know, Resident Evil 6 is actually super underrated. It's got some of the best gameplay the series has ever had. Or, answer D: I have done nothing but draw fan art of Piers Niven for the last 12 years. He is my little scrimblow, himblow, my baby. Now, for the most part, I'm an answer C kind of guy, but certain parts of that game, like Leon's entire campaign, got me feeling like an answer A guy. Honestly, I think Resident Evil 6 is better than Resident Evil 5. Now listen here, you damn nobody. One more statement like that and I'll open up a can of holding your ass in contempt of court. Your Honor, after Josh drops you off on the island and you spend the entire rest of the game fighting dudes with assault rifles, Resident Evil 5 just stops being fun. Now I think a big part of why people don't really like Resident Evil 6 has to do with its placement in the series. Resident Evil 4 came out 3 years after the first Resident Evil live action movie, and you can really tell because Resident Evil 4 mimics that movie's style heavily. And since the Resident Evil movie just rips off The Matrix, Resident Evil 4 is way more of an action game than a survival horror. But Resident Evil 4 is also Resident Evil 4. It's a masterclass in game design that is probably the closest to flawless a game can get. Resident Evil 5 releases 4 years after Resident Evil 4 and is basically a worse version of Resident Evil 4, but it had co-op. People mostly liked Resident Evil 5, but there were a fair amount of people that were like, okay, well, we mimicked The Matrix enough, can we get back to being a survival horror franchise? Then we get to Resident Evil 6, a third purely action game in a row, and one of inconsistent quality at that. Nobody who defends Resident Evil 6 does so for its story. 4 and 5, their writing could get corny and occasionally campy at times, but the story of 6 is downright silly. 6's entire plot can be summed up as this guy really wanted to bang Ada Wong and now the whole world is paying for it. Listen fellas, Ada is a baddie, but no woman is worth turning into a flyover. So the deck was already pretty stacked against Jake Muller being introduced in a game that people didn't really want or like after it came out, but there were 2 other playable characters introduced in 6. Piers Niven wound up as one of the most well-liked one-off characters in the series' history thanks to his contributions to what is arguably the most compelling arc of Resident Evil 6. And Helena Harper was definitely there. She was undeniably present. Nobody hates her, but you can't really hate somebody you don't remember. So Jake got most of the character-specific hate, because besides Piers and Helena, every other playable character was a returning character, which makes them somewhat immune to actually being hated. See, nobody wants to admit that the Matrix era of Resident Evil was not kind to Leon Kennedy. In every appearance past RE4 in the timeline, Leon is just awful. And RE6 is no different. He's got negative personality, no drip, his campaign is easily the worst from a gameplay and narrative perspective. And no disrespect to Matthew Mercer because he did a good job, he did exactly what was asked of him, but I kinda hate his performance as Leon. It's a very generic, cool action guy performance instead of the dork trying to be an action guy that we all know and love. On the other side, you have Chris, whose personality for 4 games now has been that he loses loses his men, loses his partner in 5, loses his squad in 6, loses his squad again in 7, loses Ethan in 8. Dog, at this point, you are the problem. Now, the flaws of the other characters don't invalidate the criticism against Jake. I'm just trying to say that if you're gonna hate him for being in a shittily written game, you gotta hate these guys too. But there is in fact some valid criticism against Jake that I'm gonna talk about real quick. See, my client has been accused of being a poochie. The term poochie, for those who are unaware, is a reference to The Simpsons. See, the executives of Itchy and Scratchy, a Tom and Jerry spoof in The Simpsons, decided that the show needed a cool new character to reignite interest. So they devised Poochie, a character who has every stereotypically cool trait slapped on top of him, and who gets a lot of runtime dedicated towards convincing the audience that he is in fact cool. Poochie doesn't belong on the Itchy and Scratchy show. He feels forced because he is forced. He ruins the flow. His presence tanks the parts of the show people actually like in favor of trying to make Poochie more popular. Think Roman Reigns before he became the tribal chief. Now, I won't deny the trait that Jake and Poochie have in common. Capcom definitely wanted Jake to be cool. He's a wisecracking Scarface bad boy mercenary who gets a ton of badass moments. The dude jumps a motorcycle over a helicopter. That's what you'd get if you asked an AI to come up with a badass moment. Not to mention he's voiced by Troy Baker, who was one of the default main character voices of the 2010s. And the end of the game sets Jake up to be the main character of the series going forward. But the big difference between Jake and Poochie is that Poochie doesn't belong in Itchy and Scratchy. Jake is a perfect fit for the game that he's in. Jake Muller represents everything wrong with Resident Evil 6 and everything good about Resident Evil 6 simultaneously. His existence by itself is a nonsensical bit of writing, but he's the only character whose story isn't totally off the rails. He feels like a 14-year-old's OC, but he's actually got an arc and shows some depth. Then on top of that, I feel like he's got the best campaign gameplay-wise in a game that's strongest redeeming quality is its gameplay. I'll start with the issue of Jake's existence being bullshit. Jake is the son of Resident Evil's former main antagonist Albert Wesker. Now, anybody who knows anything about Wesker would find the idea of him having a kid just a little bit odd. See, Albert was one of many children selected for Project Wesker, a program that took children that were believed to have superior genes that would make them resilient to the negative effects of certain viruses. Plain and simple, it was a eugenics program set up by Umbrella to help find the next evolution in humanity. So Albert was pretty much raised by Umbrella. Then when he was old enough, he got a job at Umbrella and helped turn the T-virus into a zombie virus. Then he did a stint in the military to be a mole for Umbrella. Then he became captain of STARS to be a mole for Umbrella. He betrayed STARS to test out Umbrella's bioweapons. He seemingly died, came back with superpowers, tried to end the human race. The point I'm trying to make is that from beginning to end, from childhood to his death, this dude never did anything that didn't further his evil supervillain agenda. Except for one specific time. Hey Albert, what were you doing in 1991?
Having sex.
If you go and read Albert Wesker's biography on like the Resident Evil wiki or something, it's literally paragraphs upon paragraphs of evil shit. 2 sentences talking about how he had sex and conceived Jake, and then right back to evil shit for the rest of the biography. And you know what? Jake's mom was super in love with Albert, so it wasn't clinical doing it for a scientific reason sexual intercourse. This dude was getting freaky. If you told me that of the like 10 characters in the series that have canonically had sex, Wesker was one of them, I'm losing that bet. I'm not even getting close. I couldn't imagine this freak bastard going to the bank and you're telling me he's hitting it raw, finishing inside, and leaving her in love with him for the rest of her life? If you told me that he artificially inseminated a bunch of women to have an army of Weskers, I could believe that. If you told me that a Umbrella researcher somehow stole his sperm and used it to give herself a Wesker baby, I could believe that. I do not believe Wesker is laying pipe. Well, now that I know Wesker can get horny, what are you doing with that picture of Rebecca in your desk, huh? Why'd you put Jill in that costume? Oh, you sick freak pervert bastard. Somebody should kill you in a volcano. Once again, truly, terribly sorry for your loss, Jake, truly. Point is that from a writing standpoint, Jake Muller should not exist in the manner that he does. But despite that, Jake being Wesker's son is obviously the core of Jake's story in 6, and if you get over the circumstances of his conception, Jake's story is actually pretty solid as far as Resident Evil 6 goes. Now, to be fair, that's mostly because him and Sherry barely deal with the fake Ada nonsense, but also because his story is pretty straightforward. It has an anchor to keep it from falling apart, and it has a consistent driving force behind it. In our introduction to Jake, he shoots up with C-Virus and gets superpowers from it just like dear old dad did with T-Virus. This shows us Jake has special blood, and then Sherry comes in and tells us Jake has special blood. Jake's special Wesker blood that makes him immune to bioterrorism is the anchor. The good guys want Jake's blood to create a vaccine for the C-Virus, and the bad guys want Jake's blood to get better at bioterrorism. Sherry represents the good guys, and the bad guys are represented by Ustanak. Ustanak is really the driving force behind Jake's campaign. He is the invincible pursuer archetype that we've seen in plenty of Resident Evil games. Jake and Sherry escape Ustanak, Ustanak chases Jake and Sherry. It's a lot simpler than the other two campaigns, which means the narrative never gets stupid. There's no Illuminati group that's been secretly controlling everything, and there's no kidnapping 1,200 women to clone an Ada Wong that'll bang you going on in Jake and Sherry's campaign. No, our main character has special blood and we gotta cure the virus with it. That is a good enough action movie plot that fits right in with saving the president's daughter or stopping a mad scientist. And you guys already know that I'm a sucker for the final boss fight being a knockdown, drag out, winner takes all fist fight on an elevated platform. Overall, I'd say Jake's campaign has the best story of the three just because it's the least connected to 6's plot and is more character driven than the other two. And even though Jake's existence turns Wesker into Freaksker, I do feel like it's a somewhat fitting conclusion to the Wesker story that his work winds up being used for the good of mankind. Guy whose goal is to wipe out the human race and his legacy saves the human race, that's a total defeat right there. Now moving on to Jake's character development through the game, it's a very simple arc. He starts out selfish, wanting $50 million for his blood, then ends the game selfless, willing to fight monsters for apples. You could 100% make the argument that Chris has the better character arc, but Chris's arc doesn't exactly push him forward as a character in my opinion. Chris's arc is all about him coming to terms with losing his squad in Edonia, and while that arc has a very nice conclusion with Piers' sacrifice, it ultimately serves to get Chris back to where he was before that event. And then Chris just would not stop showing up after 6, and he's just kind of the same guy he always was, except for his appearance being different and his voice being different. The main thing that makes me put Jake's arc over Chris's is Jake's dynamic with his co-op partner Sherry. First things first, you're playing as Wesker and Birkin in this campaign, and that's cute. Second things second, the return of Sherry Birkin to the series is actually one of Resident Evil 6's best moves narratively. The little girl that Leon and Claire saved back in Resident Evil 2 grew up and decided to help people the same way Leon and Claire helped her. The daughter of the man who caused the Raccoon City outbreak, who infected his own child with the virus that turned him into a monster, uses the abilities granted to her by that incident to fight bioterrorism. That is a logical and compelling evolution of the character and a pretty satisfying emotional payoff for fans of the series. And it's actually Sherry's evolution as a character that serves as the catalyst for Jake's growth as well. Early on, Jake is very disrespectful to Sherry and discounts her status as an agent. But after they take shelter in a cabin and Sherry tells Jake about her life, his demeanor towards her changes. See, Jake strikes me as the type of person who's pretty dismissive of everyone who he believes that he has had a harder life than. An immature outlook for sure, but Jake has had something of a hard life. Believe it or not, this is a 20-year-old. Sherry is a whole 6 years older than Jake, but to be fair, that G-Virus don't crack. Point is, Jake winds up respecting Sherry a great deal after the cabin cutscene, because knowing what Sherry's gone through and seeing the woman that she's become in spite of it gives Jake a lot to think about in regards to his own life. Jake's newfound respect for Sherry is most prominent later on in the locker room of the Chinese facility. And no, I don't mean the part where Jake looks away while Sherry's Hammerhammers are out. I mean the part where Jake is despairing over his dad being a world-ending mad scientist. Sherry tries to reassure him that he isn't his father, Jake is his own man. But Jake thinks the reason he kills people for money is because his dad passed down the asshole gene. And when he throws this logic at Sherry, she immediately counters with this line.
I am. Things that I've done. At least it all makes a little bit more sense now. What?
You can blame your father all you want, but at some point, you have to take responsibility for your own actions.
This cutscene is a crucial moment. It's honestly the turning point of Jake's character. Sherry cuts right to the heart of the matter and then immediately shoulder checks Jake to say, end of discussion, think about what I just said. And the funny thing is that she's 100% right because she is the evidence. You know Sherry has been through the exact same dilemma that Jake is currently facing. And you could argue she had it worse because both her parents were assholes and Jake's just got an asshole dad. But she is reconciled with the fact that her parents were bad people who did some horrible things and she came out the other side as a better person because of it. Sherry's line might come across a little bit harsh, but Jake is a harsh boy and it's exactly what he needed to hear. It's the tough love equivalent of Mewtwo's classic line from the end of the first Pokemon movie. The circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. No matter what nutsack you come out of, it's what you do with the gift of life that decides who you are. Bitch. I'm pretty sure that's what he said at least. And Sherry's line very clearly hits home with Jake because only a few hours afterwards he declares that he isn't his father and the two of them are gonna save the world. And then he sells his blood for only $50 instead of $50 million. And yeah, he immediately blows the $50 on a pair of sunglasses, but it's hard to argue that Jake's character development would make any sense if it weren't for his partnership with Sherry Birkin. And that's really what puts Sherry and Jake's dynamic over Chris and Piers for me. That underlying narrative to their dynamic that Sherry has been through what Jake is going through and inspires him to help people the same way Leon and Claire inspired her to help people. I really do enjoy Piers having to pull Chris out of rock bottom, but Jake's character development being fueled by Sherry's development is really why I would say he has the best arc in 6.
You saved me. You know that, don't you? Thank you.
Moving on to my final point, Resident Evil 6 is actually a pretty good third-person shooter with a decently high skill ceiling. It can feel a little obtuse at times, like getting slowed to a complete stop every time you want to switch your weapon, and sometimes when you dodge into the prone state you can wind up rolling when you don't want to. Just instances where your muscle memory from other games can lead to awkward interactions. But once you get used to it, 6's gameplay actually makes for a pretty good time. Now, the reasons I would argue Jake's campaign is the best gameplay-wise are actually pretty simple. I think Leon's campaign sucks. The only level I like is the one where Leon and Helena have to help a bunch of civilians fend off the zombie horde, and that's more for the flavor of the level than anything. I mostly attribute my dislike of Leon's campaign to the C-Virus zombies just not being fun to fight in my opinion. I can't stand their FNAF 2 Foxy jump scare attack. Chris's campaign on the other hand is actually really solid. I don't think there's a single level that I can say absolutely sucks. It's mostly straightforward combat encounters against Joavo, and they feel a lot more natural to fight than the zombies. Like, the gameplay mechanics are more designed around fighting Joavo. I would say that Chris is the most consistent campaign in terms of quality, and you could argue that makes it the best from a gameplay perspective, but I think Jake's campaign does more interesting stuff while still having a fair amount of Joavo combat. The only part of Jake's campaign that I would say absolutely sucks is the snow level where you can't see anything and you're just running around picking up the USB sticks. But after that and the snowmobile section, I'd say Jake's campaign gets really good and pretty interesting. You get the stealth segment in the ice cave with the bugs, you get the game's only example of horror and tension when you gotta spin the valves like crazy while Ustanak breaks through the door behind you. You got the part later on where you have to drive the boat while fighting the Chainsaw Man a third time. And then Jake's entire Chapter 3 is probably my favorite segment in all of Resident Evil 6. I love the Chinese research facility. It starts off with a melee only segment, and then that leads into the mansion part of the facility where you have to go room by room collecting ID medals to unlock doors. You need 15 ID medals to access half the facility. Could you imagine working in this place? Hey Dan, can I get your ID medal? I left my lunch in the East Wing break room fridge and I need 8 more medals to open the door. And another thing worth noting about Jake and Sherry's campaign that I think makes it stand out gameplay wise is that the two of them don't get unique guns like some of the other protagonists. You know, weapons like Pierce's anti-material rifle or Helena's Hydra shotgun. Instead, Jake and Sherry both get unique melee weapons that give them unique charge attacks. And these charge attacks are the only reason that Jake and Sherry can have a melee only segment, because their melee mechanics are more extensive than the rest of the cast. Especially Jake. His melee combos mean you play him differently than every other member of the cast. And as an added bonus, Jake and Sherry not having unique guns means they don't have an extra ammo type to take up space in 6's awful inventory system. Overall, I just always felt like they were a bit more experimental with Jake's campaign while still giving you a fair amount of combat encounters to enjoy 6's gameplay, which I think is why I always wind up enjoying it a bit more than Chris's campaign. I feel like it's got lower lows, but it's got higher highs. Now, for all the reasons that I've just talked about, I would honestly say Jake's campaign is the best part about Resident Evil 6. But my argument is that my client is not guilty by reason of comedy, and I think it's about time I explain that. Listen, in 2012, I could understand somebody playing Resident Evil 6 and hating everything about it. Operation Raccoon City came out earlier that very same year, and if you were looking for the next mainline game to redeem the series, Resident Evil 6 was not doing that. But I'd like to put forward the Yakuza 6 defense. See, Yakuza 6 was supposed to be Kiryu's final game in the series, and as a finale to Kiryu's entire story, it was very much not good. But now that Yakuza 6 isn't Kiryu's finale, it's a much better game. I would argue that Resident Evil 6 being this bombastic, playable, live-action Resident Evil was a bit of an issue in 2012. But there have been 9 Resident Evil games since 6 came out. And sure, Umbrella Corps was like the video game equivalent of pissing in the shower when the water's not on, but the rest were all pretty good. The Resident Evil series survived well past 6, and I would argue that it's thriving nowadays. Yeah, in 2012 I watched Jake jump a motorcycle over a helicopter and I said, this shit is fucking dumb. But 12 years later, moments like this range from hilariously goofy to genuinely cool. You watched Jake Muller brainbuster Ustanak during the final boss fight, and you try not to rip your shirt off and go fucking nuts in your living room. Now that I know how things play out after Resident Evil 6, it's easier to appreciate Resident Evil 6 for what it is rather than what we thought it was back in the day. It's not the beginning of the end for the series, it's a goofy game with surprisingly fun combat. And now that I know Jake isn't the death knell for the series, it's hard to hate him for his flaws. Combine that with his campaign being the best one in 6, I've actually come around to really like Jake. I honestly would love if him and Sherry came back, maybe for a Revelations 3? The ending of Revelations 2 has some pretty big implications and would make a lot of sense thematically for Jake to get involved in a follow-up to that ending. Truthfully, there's really only one problem I had with Jake in 2012 that I still have with him now. Why is he bald? Like, Capcom did everything in their power to make this dude cool. They gave him Leon's suplex, they gave him the big scar on his face, the tragic backstory, the backflips, the quips, the motorcycle, the sunglasses, but they don't give him hair? Now this isn't anti-bald propaganda, I don't have anything against bald people, I mean I wouldn't let one marry my daughter, but this dude's buzz cut looks like ass. It makes the whole design fall apart a little in my opinion. Like, it might look better in a more modern game because of better hair rendering, but I PNG'd some hair onto him, and even though it's scuffed, I like how it looks conceptually. Listen, there is an overwhelming amount of yaoi enjoyers in the Resident Evil fandom, and if Jake had hair, he'd be more popular with them at the very least. Well, Judge, that's about all I've got to say. This bastard might not be perfect, but he's got heart, and I think that means a lot. Let me tell you something, son. Ain't nobody warmed old Judge Anderson's heart like that in a long time. The prosecution's got their work cut out for 'em. Prosecution? Girlies and gays of the Jerry Jake Muller is bald.
That nigga is guilty. I don't need to deliberate. Hang that nigga now. I got the rope right here.
Jake Muller, your ass has been found guilty of first-degree attempted murder of the Resident Evil franchise. I'm sentencing you to death via bull stampede, and that's the bottom line, 'cause Judge Anderson said so. Well, you know what, Jake? We tried our absolute hardest. We gave it our all, and nobody can take that away from us.